What I want to do now is give a kind of lecture on Christian history, and it's really tough to do this in a short amount of time. And so during this lecture hour, what we're going to do is walk through Christian history in outline form. It's a bit thin, like it's not covering all the most important details, and ends with a little bit of a focus on Egypt as just a particular kind of case study as a place that has had its own history. And it goes with a PDF handout where I've given a little bit more detail of an outline. That's a handy thing to have with you as you're looking through this particular outline, as you're going through this particular lecture on Christian history. There are, of course, great texts that go through this whole story by storytellers and scholars that capture the whole breadth. And any 1 month of any of this point of Christian history would be something that's worth spending a lifetime learning and getting to know. Now, Christian history begins early on with the Jesus movement, and this is not surprising. I've argued in various places that the Jesus movement is a movement like the Pharisees of first century Greco-Roman Judaism. This is a Judaism that is under pressure by the Roman Empire and by aspects of Greek culture that tempts it to have to battle for its own sense of identity. This is done by various Jewish movements who want to represent different facets of religion in that day, to the point of saying, we're the best representatives or the true representatives of Israel, the people of God. The Pharisees were very much about law and very much about protecting the space for the law, which is God's good gift to Israel, in order to become a good people. And they yearned to be free of the Roman oppressor in the land. And actually, including the Pharisees, Jewish movements worked in a civil war to throw off the Roman Empire 66 to 73 CE, and again in the same land in 132 to 135, both catastrophic, both terribly damaging to the Jewish people and the Jewish cause. In 70 CE, the temple was destroyed as part of that first civil war, and then Judaism has to redefine itself. Out of that, there are really kind of two movements that come in history to be the most dominant. One is the Pharisaic movement, which grows on to become Rabbinic Judaism, mainstream Judaism as we see it in history. The other movement is the Jesus movement, which initially initiates with a number of Jewish followers of Jesus for the first few years, and then extends from the Jewish followers of Jesus to include Greeks, non-Jews, Gentiles, who had converted to Judaism or who were following the Jewish law, even though they were Gentile. So there were some of those converted to Christianity, to the Jesus movement, and then ultimately to include Gentiles. By the time that this temple falls in 70 CE, those movements are distinct enough that Nero, for example, can persecute the Christians in Rome in the mid-60s CE, whereas 15 years earlier, Claudius is not really able, the Emperor Claudius is not really able to distinguish between the Jews and the Christians in Rome anyway. And so in those 3 decades, there's enough of a distinction that by the time that the temple falls, the Jewish and Christian communities are becoming distinctive. However, to be fair, in the wake of the fall of the Jewish temple in 70 CE, Jewish rabbis and leaders came together and decided upon what they understood the Hebrew Bible to be, their canon, their rule for living that becomes the foundation for understanding and living out life in the generations to come. Christians adopted that same Hebrew canon for the most part as their Old Testament. So there was obviously still some conversation, still connection that goes over the next few decades. However, after the death of Jesus in 30 CE, we have an apostolic era. The earliest followers of Jesus, the 12 disciples or the 12 apostles, become missionaries and leaders throughout the world. As do the first, another few dozen, maybe 100, 120 followers of Jesus, men and women that were part of that early Jesus movement. They also become leaders throughout this particular world. And the Christianity, the Jesus movement, starts to move out throughout the Roman Empire and perhaps some places, as far away as India in those first few decades. At least that's Indian Christians today would say that Thomas, one of the apostles, made it to Western India and laid the groundwork for the church to grow in India, and is still growing there now. In that apostolic period, there are churches that are planted all over the Roman world. I'll just kind of quickly peek at this map here, which gives you a sense that of what is growing there. Excuse me. And throughout this, you're going to see this map a number of times. Throughout this Roman world, the Christian church begins to grow. And at first really only in the urban areas, which are mostly these bluish areas that you see on the map. In the urban areas, the cities in the empire, and there are quite a few cities in the empire, Roman Empire, Christianity begins to take hold and grow in that apostolic era. It's also the period of time that the New Testament writings begin to come about, first with the letters of people like Paul and maybe Peter, and maybe letters like James. Some of the Gospels begin getting written, and by the end of the century, the New Testament, for the most part, is in its form. So that's really the first generation that we see, and that's really what defines the first century. There's really a switch as we go to the second century, as it's really the followers of the apostles who are then the leaders of the church at this point. So that's quite a difference that takes place. Another difference that takes place is that Christianity becomes illegal. Starting with Nero in the 60s, there becomes a series of persecutions every generation or so where the Roman Empire would look up and say, oh, these pesky Christians, what are we going to do about them in our land? What should we do with them? Still, Christianity grows pretty rapidly during this period, and mostly organically, from person to person. There's no advertising, there's no television, there's no radio, there's no big events. Christianity is spread person to person throughout the Roman Empire, and that becomes really a signature of how that particular faith grows. And we've seen other religions grow like this in certain periods. For example, like Islam, a few generations later, a few 1,000 years later in Malaysia, we'll see it grow in the same kind of person-to-person way, which is different than it did in what had been the Roman Empire. There's severe persecutions that break out in part of these times, and other times it's just social pressure. But what we have in the second century is that Christians then begin to drift away from their primary dialogue partners being Jews, although there's still some debate and dialogue there, to being Gentile philosophers. And so Christians begin to write in philosophical dialogue. They're writing for the church to encourage them and to help them grow, to help them be safe or stable at different points, and to help them understand what they're supposed to believe rightly and do rightly. Orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And this is that period. But they're also starting to write in their own kind of skills in the second century, and then in the third, you have Christians who are able to write at a fairly sophisticated level. They're able to write apologetics. These are defenses for the Christian faith. And this begins in that period, in the 100s and 200s CE. We also have, sometime in the early second century, we have monasticism develops. What are called the Desert Fathers in places like Egypt go out into the desert and pull themselves away from the world, in which case they can then focus upon something that's essential, usually becoming in the image of Christ, prayer, study, sometimes acts of service. Now, I've got another video lecture about monasticism, and you can look into the history of it there. But it begins in Egypt and in other desert places in that early third century. We have the early creeds begin to develop. Credo is Latin for I believe. The creeds are the statements of faith of early Christians that continue on to today. They're the statements that most Christians in most times and places have believed, almost all Christians in almost all times and places. And they begin with statements like, I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, etc. And they go through the most core central things that are part of their identity. So the Nicene Creed and the Apostles' Creed are the two big ones that are part of that development. And then we have also the development of the New Testament. The New Testament starts to come together in various kinds of collections and forms. By the mid-century, 150 CE, a Gnostic Christian named Marcion made his own New Testament canon, a list of books that he said were part of the New Testament. It didn't have everything. It had an edited version of Luke and Acts, and it had some of the letters of Paul, including one that we no longer have anymore, or that's been misnamed in the list. And so he put that together, and then it was Christians saying, because Marcion had problematic beliefs, disregarded some aspects of the body and creation and things like that. And so other Christians who are more mainstream, more orthodox, they wanted to say, no, actually, these are the authoritative books. This is what the canon looks like. This is how we're going to shape our faith. And so the canon of the New Testament began to be clarified and was largely in place in the next few decades. Okay, so in the first, we've looked at this map, and we'll look at it again a couple of times. How does Christian growth work in just sheer numbers? Okay, before Christianity becomes legal in 300 CE, we actually have Christian majority places in many places of the empire. Some of them actually make, a good amount of sense. Lots of Christians in Rome. Although, considering Christianity is illegal, you must say that's a little surprising, isn't it? Place like Jerusalem and Damascus, where the early Christian events were taking place, that makes a lot of sense. Antioch, here on the West Asian ridge, right next to the most northeastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, that was a huge Christian center for the earliest Gentile Christians, and a great place for missions to begin. But we also have the key cities in North Africa, Memphis and Alexandria, Cyrene, Carthage, these kind of clear places, later Hippo, where Augustine is going to be centered, all the way up into Egypt, including what is now Paris, or all the way up into Europe, what is now Paris, and the big cities in Europe. So Christianity has established itself while still being illegal throughout many of these areas, and had actually quite an extensive following. Now, what happens when Christianity is legalized? We're going to see this lighter green color. We're going to see that Christianity then really kind of moves all the way through the empire. There are still some holdouts. Parts of Britain, parts of Germany and Northern Europe, they take longer to Christianize. In some places of what is now Russia, there wasn't a civilization established yet. And it's slower to go through, the Saharan desert. That seems to be a boundary. And it's also slower to go across the desert, the Arabian desert, and across the Mesopotamian area. It doesn't seem to settle in Mesopotamia and in India as quickly, but really stays kind of close to this large Greco-Roman area. And so there are these kind of growth periods that take place. When it comes to the details, I'm lumping together the 4th to 8th century as the Roman imperial religion. This is the time when Christianity, starting in 312, 313 with the conversion of Constantine, and then what's called the Edict of Milan, that said that Christianity was legal. Beginning there, and then Christianity becomes the official empire religion over this century. Now it moves back and forth. Julian the Apostate, a later emperor, pulls back and said, no, we're not having Christianity as the main empire or religion. We're going to go back to paganism, to the multiple gods. But it moves back and forth. But for the most part, that settles into Christianity becoming the dominant religion in the empire. Paganism is still living side by side with Christianity through the 4th century, the 300s, and so is Judaism. Judaism, quite a large religion. 7, 8, 9 million Jews in this period that takes place. And then we have a key event is the adoption of Christianity as official religion, and then the Council of Nicaea. This is a gathering of Christian leaders in the city of Nicaea, and they gather together to talk about kind of key Christian ideas. What is the Bible? What is the New Testament? Who is Jesus? All of these early theological understandings come out of this council or are talked about at this council. There are also theological writers throughout this generation of the 4th to 8th century. This is a huge period. Some of our greatest minds, including Augustine, who I talked about, he's a huge mind, not just for Christian theology, but for the entire West. But there are others, Hilary and Boethius, and there's various kinds of thinkers, and they really begin to think philosophically, but also Christianly, to shape Christian theology as it moves into the Middle Ages. During this 4th century, we also have the New Testaments confirmed, and then later on, and then Christianity grows through this period, but the empire becomes stale, and so actually the Roman Empire itself collapses, and then is sort of reformed as a Holy Roman Empire. So politically, the empire fails. And also another key feature is in the 7th century, from the 630s onward, Islam really begins to grow and becomes a global political factor. And that's going to change the fortunes of Christianity more than any other particular event in that whole period of time. So we see here by 600, before the advent of Islam, that Christianity is really well established all throughout what is the Mediterranean Sea, what was the Roman Empire, and becomes sort of the Holy Roman Empire. That's a catch-all term. It's a little bit later, but that works for what we're looking at here. Now we have Middle Ages then, and a lot of stuff happens in Middle Ages, and I'm just going to summarize some kind of key things. What we have here is with the growth of Islam, we actually then, here, this map actually may be more helpful. What we have is with the growth of Islam, it creates a lot of pressure on Christianity. So when we look here now and compare this map here, we see that within a century or two of the advent of Islam, the beginning of Islam, we can see that Muslims have largely conquered North Africa, sometimes conquered, sometimes the people converted voluntarily. Largely North Africa, part of what is now Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, as well as moving north through the Balkans, so into what is now Turkey, and then up towards the Balkans, that we have this area. And so that's a tremendous amount of territory gained by Islam and by Islamic leaders. Now there were leaders from time to time in the Christian world who were able to push back against this huge Muslim green wave. One of them was Charlemagne, who's pictured here, holding a castle. In which case, this picture here is meant to that Charlemagne in the late 700s, the 8th century into the early 9th century, he was able to pull back together what had been the Western Empire, the Western Roman Empire, what is purple in this designation here. He is able to stop the movement of Islam, which moved well into France, and push it back down into Spain. So he actually won political battles in Western Europe, in Spain and in France, but also in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, in what's now Serbia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. And so he's able to push the Muslim forces back and is then named Holy Roman Empire on Christmas Day in the year 800 CE. Now, part of this, though, led to a bit of a split that took place in the Western Church. So when we look in this map here, we actually see that what is orange is the Greek or Eastern Orthodox Church, and that would have included North Africa at the time, parts of North Africa at the time, and as well as West Asia. The Christians in this area were largely Greek-speaking, not Latin-speaking, whereas the ones in the purple area were largely Latin-speaking and adopting other local languages like German and French, or what were German and French back then. And so that Latin-Greek split was super key, but also the way that Christians were expressing themselves, the way they thought about things, was starting to pull apart during that last half of the first millennium. So that by the time of 1056, or 1054 rather, by the time that this map is trying to capture, there is a split, what's called the Great Schism, between the Western Church, which becomes the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church, which becomes the Eastern Orthodox Church. both claiming to be the ancient Christian church, but really starting to be distinguished on their own. Now, they share, for the most part, the creeds, and in the last century or so, there's been a lot of connection back between the Eastern and Western church. But there was this big split, and this made this huge difference. And part of the factors of that was the growth of Islam and the political pressure, which largely was fought within the Byzantine Empire on the right of your map in the yellow. And much of Eastern Christianity was either put under pressure, persecution, or it disappeared altogether or became subservient to Islam. And so there was a lot of pressure on Eastern Christianity during this period of the last half of the first century, or first millennium, okay? So that's a huge, huge event, okay? Now there's other things going on. Medieval spiritual life is really developing out and flowering, so it becomes much more personal. It becomes much more connected to the body of Christ, so tangible. The bread of life, the Eucharist bread was valued, the blood of Christ was valued. This became a really kind of important factor, a way that people expressed themselves. People became afraid of death, and there became a greater hope in things like heaven, a more greater fear of hell, a greater hope in angels. These sorts of things then developed during this period of the medieval spiritual life. There's also monasticism grows, right? So these are men and women that move off into their own communities in secluded places, but they also moved into places like Northern Europe here on your map. This area was Christianized, not just by social change or by military might or negotiation. This also happened because monks moved their communities into these places and set up hospitals, libraries, schools or universities, or simply, just were there praying, and eventually the area becomes more Christianized, sort of like a missionary service. During this period, we see, as I've said, the growth of Islam that moves all the way up into France, but then is pushed back to southern Spain and into the southern part of the Balkans. So that's one of the factors that exists here in this period. But we also have the Crusades. The Crusades that ran from 1096 CE and then went for the next, 100, 200 years. They fizzled out in the end. These were largely, by the way, not well won by Christians. Christians may sometimes have said they won all the Crusades, but it's not clear that they did win the Crusades. So you can see in this mapping here, Muslim lands and Christian lands are largely purple and yellow. Eastern Christians asked for help in the late 11th century. They were felt under pressure by Islam, and the Pope in Rome called for Christians to volunteer to go to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, and take back the Holy Land for the Christian kingdom from the Muslims. Okay? And that's kind of what happened in the First Crusade. The First Crusade was largely effective. It moved towards the Holy Land, and it was able to establish states in the northern part, and in Tripoli and in Jerusalem, and it's basically 4 Crusader states, as well as some other little cities and things along the western coast of Asia, on the eastern Mediterranean. So there was some success there. Suleiman the Magnificent pushing back. Suleiman the Magnificent is later. Saladin pushes back and wins, has greater technology. They're fighting on their home turf in the desert, and the Crusades end up being this terrible, terrible event. They're ineffective, and they've been terrible for Christian history ever since, and there was a lot of suffering on both sides, including a lot of Jews who were killed in this particular area. So the Crusades are part of a medieval Christian experience that is negative in a few ways, and one of the ways it was negative was that the Pope promised that if you go to the Holy Land on a crusade, if you die on the way, you'll go to heaven. And there's been some dispute in Catholic theology about whether that was like the right way of doing things. What we also have finally in the Christian history in Europe in the 11th century, 12th century, the reintroduction of Aristotle's way of thinking into the Christian realms. And a number of Muslim technological developments took place. So you get things like algebra, planetary movements. There are a number of things that are learned about physics and astronomy from the Muslim world, as well as a number of Muslim thinkers who are in dialogue with Christians because they share places like Toledo, Holy Toledo, right? Aragon, Cordoba, Seville, as well as parts of North Africa and the Balkans. So there's conversations happening between Jews and Christians and Muslims during the medieval period. The result is technological development for Christians, as well as scientific development, and then finally theological development. Now, by comparison, however, like in the year 1200, Islam was in its golden period. It's strong technologically. It's growing. It seems kind of fresh and innovative, whereas Christianity is struggling to innovate, struggling in the Christian Western realms to really find its voice and to really solidify itself. So Islam really has the upper hand in this period, and Christians, I think, would have to view themselves, these crusades, as having been fortunate in the sense that they didn't lose more badly, because there were sometimes overmatched in technique and technology, as well as manpower. Okay, now the fortunes tilt, though, and it's unclear exactly why all this happens, but there does come a point where Islam in the Mediterranean world begins to be a bit stale. It sort of peaks in the mid-1500s, and then it goes into decline, at least technologically and in terms of innovation and effective government. And so Christianity is given a bit of space to breathe. But there's also a number of huge events, like the plague. The plague wipes out, I don't know, a third of Europe, right? But it's also a global thing, and other parts of the world suffered as well at key times. This may have actually given, in some places of Europe, more land, more opportunity for wealth development, and so then opportunity for emergency innovation that could happen during the time of the plague and in the generation or two after. But 100 years, for example, in Britain, Great Britain, 100 years after the plague in the mid-1300s, Britain had finally recovered its population, but it had also become a little bit wealthier and was more effective at using its tools, the tools of trade and the tools of agriculture. We also see shipping gets developed in this period. So it becomes a huge period of shipping that starts regionally, and then ultimately by the end of the 16th century, Europe's going global. It's a huge global phenomenon of shipping. So we see European colonization all over the world. There was a phrase that the sun never sets in the British Empire. That was true maybe 150 years ago or so. But that's because Britain had colonized in every time zone in the world. There was some city, province, or whole country that was in some negotiated relationship with Britain. In Canada, that was a settlement that began in the late 1400s, really with other countries other than Britain, into the 1500s, and then especially from the 1600s on, a series of sort of battles between France and Britain in order to call the native territories of Aboriginal people here in Canada to call them British or French. And so that colonization process happened here, as well as the United States and, Latin America with other European groups, Sub-Saharan Africa, or parts of the Middle East and Asia, parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia, India and the other countries in the Indian subcontinent, and throughout the world. Most places had some colonization effort. Even Japan was colonized by Portugal, and more mildly by Germany before it closed its doors in the 1630s and effectively kicked out colonization. Colonization happened everywhere, though, and that became really a source of wealth for Europe, but also the ability to spread their innovation, and so they were able to reproduce and grow very rapidly during this period. However, during this period, there were theological Christian developments as well. The Bible was translated in the 1400s, and at various times, from Latin and Greek and Hebrew into French, German, and English, the local languages. And this was controversial and innovative. It means that anybody could read the Bible. Wycliffe, one of the early English Bible translators, had promised that even the plowboy would be able to read the scriptures. And the idea was, if the plowboy, if anybody can read the scriptures, then they can confidently defend themselves, defend their faith before the world and before God. So they could have a clear conscience before God. So, and then at the same time, that caused tensions, and there were a number of kind of philosophical and theological ideas that caused a split in 1517 on actually Halloween Day, called Reformation Day. This was a time when Martin Luther, a German monk, Catholic monk, he asked a series of questions called the 95 Theses, asked a series of questions that begin to kind of separate, and the church's reaction was to defend itself, and the ultimate result was that a whole church grew up that was defining itself not as Roman Catholic. It ended up being called Protestant, and then they set up their own churches in various parts of Europe, and ultimately throughout the world, including North America. So that's a key moment that takes place at the same time that the Ottoman rule in the Muslim world is peaking and then beginning to decline. And it declined, from the mid 1400s. They defeated the Byzantine Empire, the Greek Christian Empire, in 1453. But after that, it's really a decline for much of the next 400, 500 years. In the 17th century, what's really interesting, we have here, in this map here, kind of like the religious divisions of Europe, sometime in the 1700s, the beginning of the 1700s. And so we have Roman Catholic is still where this green is throughout much of Southern Europe. France, even though it had a strong Calvinist Protestant ethos, it ultimately nationally remained French. Germany, though, where the Reformation began, went to Lutheran, the pink Lutheran Protestant, including much of Scandinavia and parts of Eastern Europe as well. Russia remained Eastern Orthodox, but much of Eastern Europe had various kinds of mixes of Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, and Islamic beliefs, particularly in the Ottoman Empire in the south, what is now the Balkans. England became Anglican, as did parts of some other small parts of the world, and Scotland, though, became Calvinist, except for there's some Catholic territories in the Highlands, and Ireland largely remained Catholic. And so there are some divisions that took place throughout the world. And so Christianity in the 1600s and the 17th century in Europe just splinters. 16th century, 17th century, it splinters. But there's also an intellectual movement that happens in the 17th century. It's called the Age of Reason. Christianity goes through an intellectual exercise. Christian Europe begins to rethink of itself in terms of statehood and in terms of science. The university grows rapidly, and there's Christian growth that begins to happen in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. So the southern hemisphere begins to grow. Now, in the 18th century, okay, we're coming up, fairly soon, we have something called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is basically a philosophical tradition that says through reason alone, through the mind alone, through logic, science, self-evident truth, we are going to understand what the world is like. And we can. Humanity can do it. Or specifically, man can do it, as they would have said then. And the Enlightenment happens in Europe and America. And that, in many ways, is a throwing off of religion, so that today, mainland Europe, Western Europe, is pretty post-religious. There are very few people who say they're so committed to their faith that they would go to church each week or each month, or that they would pray daily. Europe is largely what's called a secular place. However, that's in Western Europe. In Britain and in America, the United States of America, the Enlightenment also happened with the First Great Awakening, a huge revival, a series of revivals that really then defined it. So in America and in Britain, Christian thought developed intellectually as the same time as the Christian heart grew, and that there was a large growth in religion. And those two things worked together philosophically in Britain as well as in America. though not so much in mainland Europe. We also have during that period, just after that period, America secedes from England and becomes its own country. The 19th century, the next century, is a really darker century in a lot of ways. Innovatively, things were moving along quite industrial, and that caused a lot of pollution and some poverty. We have a number of events. So, for example, Catholicism starts reacting against culture and political democracy, and so the First Vatican Council has those conversations. Protestants develop a liberal wing, which means they want to have their Christian thinking founded not on Scripture or the heart of Christianity, but based on intellectual ideas that come from science. And so there's some rejection of things like miracles, or there was some that Christians that began to believe that Jesus wasn't raised from the dead, or that was not born of a virgin by Mary. So that's a big movement that takes place in the 19th century. But there are also movements of evangelicalism and other great awakenings where more personal faith, sometimes intellectual, sometimes anti-intellectual, grows up in America, in Canada to a certain extent, in Great Britain. Those movements develop in that 19th century. Colonialism begins to falter globally. It begins to split a little bit, but doesn't finally split until after the Great Wars in the 20th century. Europe becomes democratic, and so does Canada develops a democracy, as well as the United States develops a democracy during the 19th century. But the U.S. Civil War is a big factor in the United States, and almost splinters the whole country, then pieces it together. Canada's formed as a nation rather than a colony during that American Civil War, partly as a defense mechanism, but partly because it was just time for this particular country to grow. So I've brought Christian history up to the 20th century. So before we get into the 20th century, what I wanted to do was use this map here and get a sense of the growth of Christianity so you can see it, because it changes so dramatically in the 20th century. So Christianity is largely a local affair up to 1900. It's largely Europe and then North America, but the colonization and then rapid growth of the church throughout the world in the 20th century is really one of the huge stories, particularly since so many people have thought of Christianity as being as Europe and North America being post-religious, but it isn't post-religious. The world itself has actually continued to grow and to change. Okay. So what I want to do is to use this map of the spread of Christianity, and I want to show how it began in Jerusalem and began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, as I've shown in other maps. This goes through the first 300-400 years, then Christianity is legalized, and there's this kind of more rapid, particularly rural growth through the extremities of the empire. And then at 600 CE, as Christianity is in Western Europe, we suddenly see the birth of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. And as Islam grows, then Christianity begins to shrink throughout North Africa and parts of Southern Europe. At the same time, however, Christianity is also growing throughout the northern part of Europe. In the 11th century, we have the Crusades, this movement back and forth as Christianity is kind of fighting for survival in the East, but in the West is defining itself now by technological and intellectual development that we see taking place. And then colonization just explodes Christianity throughout the globe. The Americas is developed, but also Southeast Asia, Australia, subcontinent of India, there's later development, and sub-Saharan Africa. North American colonies, of course, become largely Christian, various kinds of Christian, but so does sub-Saharan Africa throughout the 20th century. This is a huge story, and there's a huge global development that's taken place that makes a critical difference to how we understand the world as a Christian place today. This is like a key thing to understand this, and to see. It's true, we would call North America post-Christian in some ways, but Latin America, South America, is redeveloping, re-understanding its Christianity in a really kind of rapid and personal kind of a way. Sub-Saharan Africa Northern Africa is more Muslim, but Sub-Saharan Africa is a place where there is large, rapid development during this period. So that much of South Africa would be considered Christian in today's understanding of people expressing themselves in the Christian faith, at least Sub-Saharan Africa. Parts of Asia are more Christian than others. We have, some of the islands here in Southeast Asia as well as Australia, there's a Christian development. But statistically, we need to understand, there's 50 or 100 million Christians in China. Maybe 100 million Christians in Southeast Asia. South Korea becomes a largely Christian place. And so there's some things the map just can't tell us. But the growth was rapid. The 20th century was defined by this huge growth of Christianity. Christianity becomes a global movement spoken by tens of thousands of languages and dialects. And in every continent and in most countries in the world, there's an active Christian presence. But it's also a personal movement. So it's not just that people are adapting the Christian ideas, they adapt it, but they also want to make it a personal thing for themselves. Counterbalancing that is you have secularism in the Western world. So much of America, more of Canada, even more of Great Britain, and almost all of Western Europe is largely post-Christian. They may have Christian names, they may celebrate some of the Christian holidays, but the personal aspect of faith has largely moved on. The United States of America is really the only modern nation state in the wealthiest countries of the world that still retains a very large Christian presence within its community. In the 20th century, we have the growth of Pentecostalism, this huge movement of people that express themselves in these florid and powerful ways. They speak in languages that they haven't learned. They see miracles. They see visions of what God wants them to do. They reach out and they want to heal people, and they touch people for their healing. And that movement has grown throughout the world, so that much of Catholicism in Latin America has this edge of Pentecostalism to it. Many places in Sub-Saharan Africa, Christianity has expressed itself as a Pentecostal movement. It's really been a dynamic force. In China, it's a dynamic force. Much of Korean Christianity is Pentecostal Christianity. It's really quite remarkable. Eastern Orthodoxy has had an interesting revival after World War I, initially. Partly that's because Islam became restricted. Turkey made a bad choice to join the Axis in World War I, and Eastern Orthodoxy found itself free in certain ways to kind of grow and adapt. Later, this orthodoxy takes longer under former Soviet states because orthodoxy was officially wrong. And so then after 1990 or thereabouts, the fall of the Soviet Union, Orthodoxy has a bit of a recovery in the late 20th century again. People returning to their Orthodox roots after decades and decades of communist or Soviet rule. We also have a fourth great awakening in North America, and a little bit in Britain during the 20th century. Again, this personal recovery of faith. But we also have, of course, the Hitler era, which is remarkably damaging for morale, for Christian self-understanding, for the community of the people and Christian witness. But within that community of, within Hitler's world, there were Christians who were working against what Hitler was doing, using peaceful and sometimes even non-peaceful or military means to try and stop Hitler and the Holocaust. And so this was not a huge movement, but an important one for Christian history. In the mid part of the century, 1948, the World Council of Churches was founded. This is a collection of all Christian religious movements together that talk about things like faith, witness, social justice, human rights, and things like that. Because, the United Nations is also founded at this time, as is Israel. Is refounded in 1948. Israel retakes its land, and that affects Christian history less directly, but it is involved because places like the United States has tended to back either Israel or Palestine, and places like Muslim nations have tended to back the Palestinian authorities, and Europe has been divided on these issues, as has Canada. We also have Roman Catholic, the Second Vatican Council, and this is absolutely critical. This changes Roman Catholicism in the 1960s under Pope Paul the 23rd, because it means that the worship moves from Latin to everyday language. The theology and the way of living is updated. It's more invitational. And so for Roman Catholics, this has been a period of new energy and some confusion and difficulty, because globally speaking, Roman Catholicism has grown rapidly during the last half of the last 60 or 70 years. However, in North America and in Europe, Catholicism has really shrunk in power and in numbers. And so we have those two sides of the stories. An interesting moment, I don't know how important it will be, but in 2013, Pope Benedict the 16th, who was a very conservative pope, he retired, and Pope Francis, the first non-European pope, was selected in 2013. He succeeded and is a new kind of pope. He gives a kind of new energy. He wants to reach out to the poor. He's very connected with his local community. He's also wanted to reach out, like Pope John Paul II before him, with the Muslim and the Orthodox world. And so there is a kind of a new energy with Pope Francis, and we will see what that develops. But he is also a bit more politically connected in that he understands the pressures of things. He's recently spoke about support for same-sex unions. He doesn't call them marriages, but same-sex unions, which he sees as a political compromise for the contemporary world. So we'll see where things go. But what we see in the 21st century, I'll return to in a future lecture on numbers and statistics. What we see in the 21st century is a growing Christian church, but one that has really switched from the Northern Hemisphere, particularly, Russia, Europe, and North America, to the Southern Hemisphere, where Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of India, and much of Southeast Asia, including Korea, those are the powerhouses. That's where the growth of Christianity is in. So we'll see where this goes, but what this means that in the future, in 100 years, Christianity will be much more black and brown than it is white. It will be much less English, although English will still be a part of it, as it will be Latin languages, and other European tongues, but as well as Chinese, Korean, Hindi, and other kinds of languages. These are the languages of growth. These are the peoples that it will develop as the church moves into the next generation. Now, just briefly, what I wanted to do was highlight Egypt as a Christian history story because it is unique and actually separates itself out from the rest of the world, so it makes a kind of interesting case study. Now, Christian history in Egypt is interesting because Jesus hid from Pilate. His family took him, Mary and Joseph took him to Egypt to hide from Pilate, who wanted to kill him. Of course, not Pilate, King Herod, who wanted to kill him as a baby because he was self-conscious. Now, Egyptians believe that, we don't know this historically exactly, but the legend has always been consistent, that St. Mark, John Mark, who wrote the second gospel, Matthew, Mark, he moved to Alexandria and started the church in Alexandria in northern Egypt in 33 CE, so just 3 years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. So one of the early churches are apparently in Egypt. We don't know that for sure, but we do see in the New Testament that there are Egyptians in the book of Acts who come and hear about the faith and bring it back into Ethiopia or Egypt. So it's quite possible that Egypt is quite involved, and Egypt becomes, before Christianity is legal, Egypt becomes really the largest, most active Christian center in the world, particularly Alexandria in the north. And so there is some credibility to this, but of course Alexandria is such an important city historically that we can see how legends might grow. Egypt becomes a key place for certain theologians. Clement of Alexandria, Origen works in Egypt for much of his period, and then Athanasius, really one of the greatest minds of history, is from Egypt as well. And then Augustine is working in Algeria, just to the west of Egypt, in Hippo, ancient Hippo, which is not really a city anymore. Monasticism develops in Egypt. So Egypt's really important, not just theologically. Athanasius is key to the Council of Nicaea and the developing of Christian theology. So not just in theological terms and not just in historical terms as far as numbers, but also the monastic movements begin in Egypt, going out to the desert, getting away from the world, praying and doing acts of service and study in the desert away from the world to become more Jesus-like. This begins in Egypt with the Desert Fathers. Now, not long after the advent of Islam, right, not long after the Prophet dies, in the late 630s, the Rashidun Caliphate move into Egypt and they conquer them. And they really conquer them in three kinds of ways. Some people actually convert to Islam. Some Christians convert to Islam. This maybe because Christianity was stale to them, or because it wasn't meaningful, or because they were afraid. But there is a conversion of Christians immediately to the Muslim move. The second thing is there are a number of Christians communities that submitted to Islam. They received a dhimmi status, which means that as a monotheistic religion, they could continue to practice Christianity, but there were limitations. They had to pay a tax, which they paid, by the way, for the next 12 centuries. And they also had limitations about arms and trade and things like that. And then there were some Christians that simply chose to fight to the death. Some monks did this in monasteries, and they almost all inevitably lost. If they didn't lose in the first few days of a fight, they would lose within the first few years. It was a terrible fight for them to fight, and almost always the Caliphate army won. Not every individual battle, but they won every war eventually. So what happens is Christianity in Egypt gets cut off from the rest of Christendom. It gets cut off from the other parts of northern Africa, which also are largely have the same story. West Asia, there are Christians in West Asia, but they're largely isolated, and they're certainly isolated from European Christians. So Coptic Christianity grows on its own. It has its own texts. It has its own tradition. It ends up with its own breed of Orthodox Christianity by itself because it's cut off from the world. And really, over the centuries, the Coptic Church nearly disappears. Not completely. There's still millions of Coptic Christians, but it really kind of lowers in social significance and lands on the sidelines of Egyptian history. Now, in the 19th century, there's a bit of a Coptic revival, partly because of the leaders give energy to the Coptic Church in the 19th century, but also Muhammad Ali, who's one of the leaders, the Muslim leaders in Egypt in the 19th century, he gives more freedom to Christians in this period. That doesn't continue forever, but it continues for a century or so until you get Nasser. You could actually look up Nasser and find out about his history, but he was oppressive to a certain number of Coptic Christians. He had a particular kind of Arab revivalism in mind, and as he did so, there were some persecution of Coptic Christians. The Coptic Orthodox Church has survived. There are about 10 million Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria members in Egypt, and maybe another 1 million in the diaspora. That makes up about 92, maybe 93% of Egyptian Christians are part of this one church, Oriental Eastern Orthodox Church. This is actually then the biggest Christian community movement in West Asia or the Middle East or North Africa. So the Maronites in Lebanon, a little bit smaller than this group, although the Maronites have quite a global community as well, like particularly in Canada. The Coptic Orthodox Church is actually headed by the Pope of Alexandria and the Patriarch of all Africa on the Holy See of St. Mark, which is the church that you see here on your screen on the bottom right-hand corner. Okay, currently that's Pope Tawardos II, and I don't know anything about him or about who he's named after. There are also sister churches to this Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria in countries like Armenia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, even India, Lebanon, and Syria, so even outside of Northeast Europe or Africa. Now, Egyptians, how are they doing now today? Well, globally, Egyptian Christians are a bit more diverse than just this Coptic Orthodox Christian, partly because, Methodist and Protestant and Anglican and Catholic and evangelical Christians have not often stayed in Europe, and sometimes Muslims from stayed in Egypt. Sometimes Egyptian Muslims or Egyptian non-religious people have moved throughout the world and converted to Christianity in other places. There's also been a kind of a history of how Egyptians, generally they do well now. They have a lot of civil rights that are supported now, and they do well in the community. Coptic Orthodox Christians tend to be a little bit more wealthy than the rest of the Egyptian population, but there are some gaps there. There's not full religious freedom for Christians in Egypt today. There are actually laws, for example, against repairing churches when there's not laws against repairing mosques, so you have to get a permit to repair a church. There's also been kind of terrorist attacks on churches, such in 2006, mob attacks on areas and ethnic Copts, ethnic Coptic Christians. For example, in 2010 in Marsa Matruh, 3,000 Bedouins attacked a city of 6,000 Coptic Christians, and Christians had to kind of huddle up, and they lost a couple of dozen homes through fire and and a lot of violence. There's been some violence against some Muslims who have converted to Christianity, as well as some legal problems that these people have faced. And over the last decade, there have been 63 churches burned or damaged, 40 of them burned, although not usually totally burned, and some of them looted as well. Contempt against Islam, as you may know about Egypt, is still a crime in Egypt, and so there could be persecution or repercussions for someone if they posted a YouTube video that showed negative things about Islam in Egypt. There could be repercussions, although there hasn't been a lot of those. More common is the Facebook fake news phenomenon, which is happening all over the world in all kinds of ways. But that said, there's just constant negative news about Coptic Christians in Egyptian Facebook. And some of them, of course, are real stories, but the vast majority of them aren't real and are actually started by troll farms, by movements that are trying to do negative things to destabilize Egyptian society. And so this is what they do. A lot of those aren't even in Egypt. They're in places like, Russia. And so they're trying to create problems within Egypt because of this. So that's an example. But there's, I think, a lot of hope among some Egyptian Christians. There's a lot of good feelings within the community in a lot of ways. They do well neighborly. And people like Boutros Ghali was foreign minister under Anwar Sadat, although Anwar Sadat was a special kind of Egyptian leader. And then Boutros Ghali later became UN Secretary General, really one of the most important figures in the world, a Coptic Christian from Egypt. It's really a significant figure. So that's a picture of Egypt. And then globally speaking, when we think of Christian history, we're sometimes tempted to think of the Christian future. And I can't actually tell you what that looks like. However, this 1 hour outline of Christian history is, I think, enough to give you an outline to be able to go and do your own research, to read stories, to look at documentaries, and really get a sense of the story for yourself. It is only an outline, and you could dive in at any point. But it is a rich history, full of story, full of sorrow, but also full of great exercises of faith, wisdom, and courage. And I hope that you can benefit from this lecture on Christian history and apply this to your studies about religion or about Christianity in particular.